Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Well, here we are. So maybe the end of your day, maybe not for SAM, but we have an amazing didactic for you today. We've got some brilliant people who have agreed to come talk to us today about resident research topics. I'm going to share my screen so that I can launch into this thing, and looking forward to showing everyone what we have to talk about today. Can you see my slides? I see a thumbs up. Lovely. All right. So here we go. Going to close that. Today we're going to talk about how to resurrect the resident researcher. We're going to discuss how we can overcome barriers to engaging residents in meaningful emergency medicine research. And I hope we can all agree this is an important topic. Certainly resident research is an important part of what we do as educators of residents, and obviously there are barriers out there that we all need help to overcome. So we've got some brilliant minds today to give us some advice on how we can do that. So let's get started. Our objectives for the session today, we're going to recognize some barriers to the successful involvement of EM residents. We're going to understand the differing perspectives of faculty and residents and how they differ. Identify tools, tips, and techniques which have been proven at some sites to facilitate meaningful resident involvement. And hopefully, we're going to improve resident and faculty research mentor satisfaction with the shared research experience. That's one of the things we hope to see from this. So there are different types of barriers we're going to discuss, and we've divided these up, and there is a lot of overlap, but we've decided to come up with a system here. Resident-specific barriers is what we're going to start with, and then we'll have mentor-specific barriers, institutional barriers, and then we're going to just have some vignettes to demonstrate our newfound competence in understanding these different types of barriers. So let's start off with talking about some resident-specific barriers. And to provide this information, we have Dr. Coates, Dr. Jordan, Dr. Malik are going to present these slides, and I'm going to hand it off to them.
All right, thank you, Dr. Paxton. So I'm Dr. Malik. I am an assistant professor at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and I am going to be presenting our slides on some of the commonly reported resident barriers to research. Next slide, please. So what's the most common barrier that most residents are going to throw out to us when we try to approach them to do some sort of scholarly activity? It's always, I don't have time for this, right? They've got to concentrate on learning the basics of emergency medicine. They have to study for in-service exams. They've got patient follow-ups, logging procedures. They're already overwhelmed. And so the thought of adding an additional thing to their schedule that they have to take care of can seem overwhelming. But there are some ways around this. Next slide, please. And some of these solutions that we've come up for this common problem include things like embedding time for scholarship within the residency curriculum and within resident schedules. If you have the ability to do like a 1 hour, once a month part of your didactics, allowing residents to work on a scholarly activity or presenting them with some sort of recurring research workshop, this is a great opportunity to sort of build that into the time that they already have set aside for learning. Additionally, one of the things that we can do for them is sort of provide them with an outline of how they can balance their time and sort of squeeze in little time frames where they can do research by kind of showing them how we set aside time in our own schedules to take care of research ourselves. Additionally, you want to make the process as easy and efficient as possible for residents. If you're trying to pull them in on some sort of project, you want to make sure that you're providing them with a timeline at the outset of when things are going to be due. It's also helpful if you can kind of show them a long-term timeline for the project so they have an idea of how much time they're going to need to commit to this. This is particularly helpful when it comes to projects that are going to require submissions to the IRB, which a lot of residents might not be familiar with. And as a former resident who tried to work my way through an IRB submission, it can be very overwhelming and take a lot of time. So these are some of the things that you can do to sort of help your residents dip their toe in the pool that is research by kind of overcoming this common barrier that they're going to report. Next slide. How about this one? I know this is another common barrier that everybody's going to hear, which is I hate research. I'm not interested in it. I'm going into community medicine. This has nothing to do with me. I don't need to know about this, right? Many, many, many residents are going to report this as the reason why they don't want to get involved in scholarly activity. Next slide. And so the solution to this common problem is sort of changing what they think of as research. If you kind of reframe what it is that they think they're going to need to do and what constitutes scholarly activity, so that, you know, they don't have this daunting picture of having to come up with an RCT on their own that they take from start to finish. And instead, maybe they are writing an article for SAEM Pulse, or maybe they are putting together some sort of foam education piece that can be put on the internet for other people to view and use for their own learning. These are things that can be counted as scholarly activity that are a little less overwhelming for residents and kind of help to overcome that barrier of research is not interesting to me. Research is not something that's relevant to me. Likewise, it's important to kind of overcome this barrier by really helping them understand how important it is to be able to evaluate research at a high level, even if they are going into community medicine. As we learn and as the information changes regarding what is standard of care, they're going to need to be able to digest whatever is currently available in the evidence-based literature, and they're going to need to be able to understand what is good evidence and what is bad evidence. And part of being able to do that involves early exposure to research so that you know what it is that you're looking at. Another way to overcome this barrier is to create a departmental culture that fosters research projects that are performed by residents and research by faculty that pull in help from residents. This is a great way to get people started who didn't realize that they were interested in this. You know, if you have a project that, you know, needs a small section written or needs a small part edited, this is a great way to pull in a resident who doesn't think that they are otherwise interested in research. And then they can find through being involved in this small part of your manuscript that, hey, this isn't so bad. I think I can do this. And it kind of helps them jump into something a little bit more in depth that is maybe their own creation. Lastly, it's great if you can provide incentives or rewards or recognition to your residents who do even small presentations, submit an abstract, you know, get a small piece published. Residency can be really painful sometimes. And so having these small episodes of positive feedback can be really rewarding for residents. And like any other kind of positive feedback mechanism, the more that it feels good to do this thing, the more that residents are going to want to. So if you have some sort of community social media that you can post when residents get something published, or when you go to a conference in person, which I hear we're going to be doing again, trying to arrange so that everybody goes and supports the resident who's presenting. These are all things that are only going to increase people's interest in performing research. Next slide. Additionally, you want to encourage a resident who has a passion or an idea that they're really into to pursue it from a research perspective. So, you know, if you have a resident who thinks that new equipment for intubation is the coolest thing in the world, see if you can get them to kind of focus that energy that they have already invested in something they're interested in into a small write-up or a small retrospective study. You know that they already like it, and so you just need to kind of direct that interest towards something that's productive. Additionally, forward calls for abstracts or conference content to residents who are interested in something that's relevant to that conference. This was actually a way that when I was a resident, I got pulled into doing some things. I had no idea that these were available until some of my mentors started sending me the calls for submissions. And because they said that they thought I could do it, I thought I could do it too. And then I did. And this was kind of one of the ways that I got involved in research. Next slide. This is another big one that many residents are going to report, which is, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no background in research. I didn't learn about this in medical school. Many residents will never tell you this, but they are very concerned that they're going to come off as stupid or less qualified because they don't know what they're doing. And so they're afraid of starting in on a project because they are afraid of having to admit their ignorance. But this is also another barrier that's not that difficult to overcome. Next slide. this is where creating some of those didactic series and on scholarship and research methods can be really helpful. If you have a resident that doesn't really know how to get involved in research or has an idea and is really kind of hesitant to pursue it further, there's lots of resources that you can provide them about how to get started in research. Some institutions have even gone so far as to write small handbooks or guides on how to complete research. And EMRA has one that's available to residents also that can kind of take them step by step through how to do any kind of project. So just sort of steering them towards some of these resources is a good way to overcome this barrier. Additionally, let your residents come sit in on your departmental research meetings. This way they can see kind of, you know, how the big kids do research and sort of what's going on in the department, and they can see kind of what goes into a project. It makes it much less intimidating when you see other people that you know kind of going through the steps of how to put together a project from start to finish and taking feedback, both positive and critical, of their work. It makes it seem less overwhelming. Additionally, encourage active participation in journal club. I know it's hard to find time to do this, but your residents will really benefit from it. The more that they have to actively engage with evidence-based medicine and publications that they have to be able to break down and evaluate whether or not this represents good research, the more that it's going to make it easy for them to initiate their own. Additionally, try and dedicate time for the residents who do participate in research so that they can show what they're doing to their peers. If you see somebody that you know doing research, it also becomes much less intimidating to you. Next slide. And then last but not least, another big barrier for residents is lack of access to mentors, or at least perceived lack of access to mentors. Maybe you have a resident who's very interested in global EM and there's no global EM person at your shop, right? That doesn't mean that this person can't start a project. It just means that they're going to need a little help getting hooked in with people who share a similar interest. Next slide. So this is where it's helpful to deliberately pair residents with a research mentor who shares their area of interest. So, you know, we all know who our co-residents were from residency. They're all over the map. I'm sure you know somebody who shares the interest of a resident who is interested in a specific area of EM that doesn't necessarily exist in your shop. This is where you dust off that old email address that you have for them, reach out to your colleague and see if they can maybe help this resident, particularly since they are interested in the same area that your old colleague is, right? It's also helpful to collaborate with other projects that are outside your institution. So take advantage of organizations that are available for residents like RAMS and EMRA, because there's some programs through there that will help match residents with mentors that are available to them. Next slide.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll have time for questions at the end. I see a lot of chatter in the chat box, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about some of that. I'm going to move directly right into mentor-specific barriers now. So we're switching gears, talking about mentors. We've got Dr. Dirks, Dr. Garg, and Dr. King and their expertise. So I will hand it off to them.
All right, thanks, James. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So I'm going to start, and a lot of this is going to overlap with what Adrian was mentioning for the resident-specific barriers. So to start, one of the specific mentor-specific barriers that we came up with is the type of residency program. So do you have a community-based emergency medicine residency program, or are you based in a large academic center? That's a huge sort of determinant on kind of the focus of research as a mission within your department. A lot of the community-based programs have less of a research infrastructure in place to kind of help foster residents in completing scholarly activities. Kind of in that similar vein, are faculty that are present in the program, are they interested in research that's available to residents? Is research and even an expectation of faculty within a specific residency program? And then, like I mentioned, is a research infrastructure in place within the department? Is there research staff? Is there folks that are interested in completing research and mentoring residents in research? And is there funding available within the department, within the institution, etc. Next slide, please. So furthermore, do faculty have the necessary skills to serve as a research mentor? Maybe they have the interest, but throughout their career, they haven't received any formal training through a fellowship, an advanced degree such as an MPH, or they haven't had the opportunity to get involved and be mentored by a researcher throughout their career. Maybe they don't have experience serving as a mentor or a coach or a sponsor. Maybe they are nervous to take a resident under their wing when they don't have the confidence or the experience in order to be a researcher or a mentor necessary or needed by that particular resident. And then finally, do faculty have the time and support to mentor resident researchers? Is there funding present in the department to give them release time in order to complete research? Is it even is there grant support that's coming in that could provide faculty with time to mentor residents? So we're gonna move on to some solutions, and that'll be the next slide.
I guess I can take this one. I think execution and success rates really are really important. And I think one of the challenges as a mentor working with residents that the completion to publication rates isn't as high as you would like, and I think that's really key for faculty success and the barriers they have. If you expect a resident to do the work from start to finish, it probably won't occur, especially if you're starting somebody late in their second year and it's a 3-year residency. I think it's important as a mentor, and barriers to ways to get success is you have to know your timeline. Whenever you start a project with a trainee, you need to really be realistic on how long it takes to mentor the resident on the project, to get through the regulatory process. If you have a fixed timeline, it can take 2 to 3 months, depending on what type of study it is, and especially if it's over the holidays. You need to understand the timeline for the data collection and then the write-up and the submission. And most important, I think, is making sure everyone on the team understands the timeline. So the residents are aware of your expectations, the faculty has their own expectations, and if the entire group is aware of the timelines, you can have a successful transition to a completion of a project and meeting everyone's aims. Next slide. So I think some of the ways to have a high likelihood of success are both the faculty and the residents need to feel like they own the project. We've already talked about it before. Residents are passionate and engaged when they actually care. And to have a resident put on a project just because they're checking a box and have no interest in it, it's destined to have failure because no one's going to be interested in continuing. I think it's also important to have faculty to be invested in the projects, because when the residents graduate, the faculty can continue. And those institutions that have had buy-in by faculty to work with resident research, when the faculty continue and everyone gets a publication that benefits the entire program. Involving a team with many different year residents to allow continuation of a project and success along a longitudinal platform. And then provide an award for completing the project, whether it's submission of an abstract to SAM, graduation requirement, or publication for the faculty. Make sure everyone understands that there is a little carrot at the end. Understanding what that carrot is for everybody is important. As a mentor right now, that's one of the first things I talk to my residents about is, what do you want from it? And if they want something for their CV, by the time they look for a job, much different timeline than if they want to submit an abstract and present nationally. And I think that's the end of mine, and on to the next presenter.
Hi, everybody. This is Nidhi. So as we spoke before, the highest execution and success rate is when it is feasible, fascinating, funded, and the resident and the mentor and everybody is very much interested. The whole team is interested. The project is not out of the scope, And that meets the final criteria, as we all know, the feasible, interesting, novel, ethnic, and ethical, and relevant. So the next slide, please. So what are the landmines here? So there are some landmines which we routinely actually incur as mentors, which are mostly regulatory and the data entry. So the resident is not interested in dealing with the regulatory work of the IRB, or they just don't have the bandwidth for that. So what would be cool is to, or they're not available all the time besides their shift to consent your patients, and then you need to have a larger team to consent the patients for your study. Another landmine which we frequently meet is the data entry. The resident on the team and the faculty both have a very limited bandwidth and they cannot do the data entry. So next slide, please. So we have few solutions for that. I think speaking along those lines of the landmines which we frequently meet, I think we can do a couple of things which will help along all the landmines which we meet regularly. One is to create the research streams that span across different years of residence. So don't do a project with just 1 year of resident, like a first year or a second year or a third year. Try to have a resident from different years. One, it gives the longevity to the project and it becomes more feasible and practical during their residency time. And it creates the, congeniality between the residents of different years and increases the interaction. And it's overall very healthy for the overall interactions of the residency. And do the projects that, of course, do you want to publish. Regarding the regulatory, I think it would be cool to have a regulatory person, if you have one in the department, and not every person will have like an IRB manager or a academic associate or a research coordinator who is trained to do this kind of stuff. If there is a person who is trained to do this kind of stuff, or even have samples which we can assist the resident and the mentor, that will save a lot of mentor time. Another thing which I have frequently utilized is having something called as research scribe, which can help a lot of mentors, because we don't have so much protected time, especially for the younger faculty who is not established, and it really helps. And another cool thing which we can do is to complete the city training during the orientation month, which we have usually for a month in most residencies, and that way everybody's covered for the 3 years which it is valid. And we think that these will potentially help in overcoming some of the hurdles that we face every day.
Great, thank you. So I've been asked to represent our group on institutional barriers. And so our group was Dr. Ehrman, Dr. Gottlieb, and myself. And the problem with institutional barriers is they're institutional. You can't necessarily change everything about your institution. Sometimes you can't change anything, but you do have potentially influence over your colleagues. Sometimes you can have influence over your boss. And you can be kind of a molder of the culture in your department and try to institute things or to promote the institution of things that may actually promote resident research. So we've identified really 5 kind of problems and barriers in institutions. And we're going to go through each of these systematically. So the first one is culture of inquiry, that maybe it's absent, and it's been discussed previously under the previous section, but I think it's important to bring this up as an institutional barrier, because when you join a department, it's going to have a culture of its own. And sometimes you can be a catalyst for change, but you still have to recognize that there's a problem. I think the second thing is lack of funding. That's never going to go away. That's always a problem for researchers, but it's also relevant for resident research. Sometimes the projects they want to do require funding, and you may not have access to that. Thirdly, research infrastructure may be absent or poorly developed in your institution, and that's something you've got to deal with. And so you can either try to change things or you can try to find ways around things. But we have some recommendations on that. Fourthly, lack of research support services, and then finally, lack of experience with resident research in general, and that as an institution. So the first barrier, departmental culture, was mentioned earlier. And I think the way that some people would view this is a perception that research distracts from the clinical mission. I personally work at a very clinical shop, and I do hear from some of my colleagues, luckily not very many, that they feel research is depleting resources that could be used for other things. Sometimes that's a battle you have to fight, and you can decide which battles to fight But at the end of the day, it is always something that you have to consider in the culture of your department. Sometimes there's a lack of appreciation of the benefits of research. People look at it as a black hole you're throwing money into and you're not getting anything back out of it. So how do you address those types of problems? Well, I think one way to do this, and you have to have collaboration and cooperation with leadership in your department, is to reframe the mission of your department. What are we here to do? Are we only here to provide quality clinical care, or are we here to actually educate our residents, educate our patients, and improve the care that we're giving? I think that's an important discussion to have, not just with your boss, but with your colleagues. And you can do this as little as or as often as you want. But at the end of the day, the goal is to try to convince everybody else that you're right, that research contributes to this mission. And even if you don't see the obvious benefits, that they're there. You need to try to demonstrate those benefits. So what are the benefits to residents? This is a popular conversation at some shops. It teaches the scientific method. It teaches residents how to think critically and how to analyze data. It advances the standard of care. Now that's big picture stuff, right? But at the end of the day, most research projects they're going to start small. You're going to build from a small project, pilot study, into a larger study. So you can't have research unless you have small projects. And resident research is exactly that, small projects. So it's possible that something a resident starts in residency is actually going to form their career, move them forward in their career, and lead to great innovation and breakthrough later on in that person or someone else's career. But at the end of the day, you may never see that. So you have to convince people that it's there. They have to have faith. And I think finally, enhancing the reputation. It was mentioned earlier, Dr. Dirks mentioned about publication. It helps the whole department. And I think that's important to remember. Even the people that aren't actively involved in research or working with residents still get to benefit from the prestige and the esteem that come from being a high publishing department. So I think that's something that you can emphasize as a way of trying to change and alter the culture as you go forward. Another barrier is research funding, and many departments have this problem. You don't have internal funding. Not a lot of funded researchers in the department. I work at a shop. We're very lucky to have a lot of experts in how to find funding, and they can help me. But not everybody has those mentors or those people that they can ask questions to, at least not at their site. So they're not sure how to get funding. At the end of the day, I think that the solution here is to remember that you're not alone, that people in your department may be able to provide grant mentorship and help you learn how to apply and find those funds. But at the end of the day, maybe sometimes you have to collaborate externally and look for people that are outside of your department to help you get there, to figure out where that money can come from. Start small, aim big. So small funding sources for small projects, but with having a goal in mind that eventually you can have more funding than you have today. I think taking small steps is important, and every single source of income, source of funding could be the one that helps to move your department forward in terms of identifying these sources of funding. I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of sources for funding outside of your department, outside of emergency medicine. I think we often think about EMF, SAMF, we think about the foundations that are obviously relevant to emergency medicine, but we not think about the non-emergency medicine related funding opportunities. Institutional funding might be possible, whether you have an affiliated university or even within your department. Maybe the department has some alumni who've donated money and it can be earmarked for research purposes. So be aware of those resources, figure out what they are, and sometimes you can actually fit the resident project or the scale of the project to the funding that you have available. Another big problem, infrastructure. This is so common. A lot of programs don't have a designated person who's being paid or giving protected time to do the function of a research director. And this is a big problem because if it's not one person's job, then it's nobody's job, right? So if you don't have a designated research director, there are many tasks that simply won't get done or won't get done in a timely manner. And the same thing is true for lack of a resident research director. It's probably not reasonable to expect that a person who's the director of clinical research or a vice chair of research in your department can also handle the additional task of managing resident research. It's a lot of work. Working with learners can be challenging. And so they need help. So there should be someone in your department who's designated as a resident research director. Doesn't mean they have to do everything, but they need to coordinate efforts. They need to supervise, make sure it's happening, make sure things are being done properly. And I think that's an important step towards overcoming this barrier of lack of appropriate leadership. you need to have mechanisms to track and disperse funding. And not just that, but to track and disperse protocols and who's working on projects. This is the role of perhaps a resident research director, but you could also have ancillary staff who could assist in this. But those people need to be identified, trained, and properly paid to do those jobs. And then finally, in this, you have to have, you may have inadequate support of residency leadership, academic faculty to really engage in these research topics. So how do you overcome that? Well, I think, first of all, as I mentioned, find yourself a research director. If you already have one of those, make sure you have a dedicated resident research director. And it probably isn't going to pay to let that be the same person that is doing research director for the whole department. Best to have somebody else. Maybe this is a person who could one day aspire to become the research director, but this is how you get your training wheels, learning how to work with residents, learning to find funding, learning how to get protocols approved, et cetera. So, and then consider how you can establish internal seed funding and then have somebody in charge of that and make sure that you have those pathways of communication open. Importantly, provide faculty research training. So if your faculty aren't qualified or don't feel they're qualified, find a way to make them qualified. That we have a lot of courses available through ASAP SAEM to train faculty in research techniques and take advantage of those as much as possible. And then look for topic and research experts, people that you can help to, who can help to train and educate your staff. Support services, I mentioned before, it's good to have a person to manage funding, to manage residents' schedules and match them up with mentors. But the problem is a lot of these things don't exist for some departments. Do you have a grants manager? Do you have a stats support person? Do you have a library? Or do you know about the library support services that are available? Maybe you don't have anybody to collect data. Maybe you don't have research associates, or you have no publication support. So people don't always have time to be publishing their results. And so if you want to increase your productivity and work with residents more often and do better work with residents, you sometimes need to find these resources. And without money to do so, it can be challenging. But I think it's important to consider options. So try to look out, think outside the box. If another department, for example, has a great grants manager, and maybe they're not overtaxed, is it possible your department could share the grants manager? Can you collaborate and work with another department and try to split the cost of this type of resource? Identify what resources you have in your institution for statistical support, for a medical librarian. These are people that are probably there that are probably being paid by somebody. You may not know about them, and maybe it's another department that's paying them, but maybe you can leverage those resources. And then of course, look for residents, look for students to help with recruitment and data collection. Just because you don't have paid people to collect data doesn't mean it can't happen. You may have to be a little more aggressive about finding people to help. But I mean, residents know residents, residents mentor students. This is a great way to collect your data by having residents working with students on their projects. And then importantly, identify publication mentors. And if you as a faculty you don't feel like the best writer, find someone who is and get their help, get their mentorship. A lot of people, the best writers in this audience or on this panel started out not knowing how to write very well, I'm sure. And so how did you learn? Well, you read a lot of papers and you learned from smart people that knew how to write. So do that. Find those resources in your department or outside your department and leverage those people. I think people don't feel adequately experienced to supervise residents. Maybe they don't have research training. Maybe they don't have teaching skills, or they don't think they do. Maybe they don't really know the residents and they don't think that they can empathize and identify with the residents well enough. They may not know how to get started. It's intimidating. Working with residents can be challenging, right? Because you're teaching something that you may not even yourself be that sure of. So I think it's important to get over this barrier. You need to work on development of your faculty, right? They need to be well developed before they can help develop your residents. So that's an important first step. And you can't underestimate the importance of that. Also, utilize online resources. I mentioned before, there are ways, classes and virtual resources that you can use to train your faculty and your residents on how to do a research methodology, how to design a study, and so on. Identify research mentors. We've mentioned that several times, but it's so important for faculty too, identifying mentors and how you can learn from them to work with residents and to do research, of course. And then I think importantly, identifying a resident research director also speaks to this. It helps to coordinate efforts and streamline the process. So I think in summary, for institutional barriers, cultural change has to start at the top. You can't change your department, but you can be an influence for change, and you can be a catalyst for change. Departments have to establish and maintain an infrastructure that supports resident research. You can't do that yourself either, but you can certainly look for what's available, and you can make sure that you're aware of all the resources that you may have at your disposal. Education and training of faculty is a responsibility of the department, and you should point that out to them, that one of the missions of the department should be to develop and teach faculty, not just residents. And part of that process is going to spill over into resident research. And I think you're going to see benefits. The more competent and confident your faculty are, the more likely they're going to be able to contribute back and give back to the residents as well, because they're going to be eager to share what they learned when they were being educated. I think importantly, you have to stress to your faculty, to your administrators, that investments in time and money are required, but they will pay off, that there are dividends that they will reap later on that may not be immediately obvious to them, but will eventually lead to improved prestige and success for the department as a whole. So I'm going to hand now off to the section on overcoming barriers. We got some vignettes. We're going to talk through some of these concepts. And to help us with this, we got Dr. Messman and Dr. Vargas. So without further ado, here they are, and we'll go through some vignettes.
All right. I'm Ann Messman. I run the MedEd Fellowship and the Vice Chair of Education for the department. And Dr. Vargas is one of my former fellows. She's at Cleveland Clinic. And so we decided collectively that the two of us were going to go straight to the residents and try to ask them, without feeding them any answers, you know, what are their, what do they think the barriers are to completing a scholarly project. So I'm going to share my screen. Sorry, Paxton, this will stop you from sharing your screen.
Not a problem.
All right, so this is one of Dr. Vargas's
The first obstacle I'd probably say is really just time to complete the research project. We do a lot of clinical shifts and just have like a lot of clinical duties that we're responsible for. So I think that takes up most of our time. Also, I've done some bench research in like undergrad and during medical school, and I've just found that research isn't something that I'm like extremely passionate about. So I haven't really gone out of my way to take that next steps to continue doing research, because I'm more interested in medicine from like a clinical aspect than more of a research aspect, although I think research is important and you need to do that to learn and better your practice as a clinician. As for like actually doing the research hasn't been something that I've been like extremely passionate about.
Okay, so common things that residents say. We have an interview with the first year, a second year, and a third year. That physician is an intern. And one of my comments when I listened to her argument was that timing is very important. And so if you're approaching a resident to do a research project with you, if you're the faculty member, you need to make sure that you're approaching them at a time that's good for them. You know, at the beginning of their SICU rotation, probably not the best time for them to do a research project. So establishing early on that they have the time, that they're in a good place, they're on a rotation where they feel like they can invest a couple hours a week on a research project or whatever the time commitment is really important.
You got the next one?
Dr. Vargas, did you want to talk? You are muted.
Sorry, I missed it. So yeah, bench research is very different from clinical research. And I think expressing this even at, July intern orientation and just kind of introducing them back to what clinical research is, especially when they see their MD, PhD colleagues go off and do research, it is generally bench research. So they have become accustomed to the thought process that bench research is the only research that's out there. So just reintroducing that and broadening their scope of what exactly research means. This could also mean that at intern July teaching, you have your own faculty come, or even some of the second years or third years from last year, just kind of give a brief overview of the types of projects that have been done the past year. One, you can always branch off of current projects or previous projects. And then two, it'll let them know, if they see someone did do a research project on intubation techniques and intubation equipment, they can then start that thought process when they are on their shifts. And if they run into something that they're like, well, this could be improved upon. So that's one of the major arguments to kind of make when you have a resident who's saying that they're just not interested in research, just broaden their scope.
Very good. Dr.
Great.
Messman,
And
you have some more, right?
yeah, yep, I've got another 2 more videos for you guys. This is a PGY2.
The second reason, starting my second year, I knew that I really wanted to prioritize the quality improvement project and my scholarly project in residency. And I felt like there were a lot more options presented to us for the scholarly project that didn't involve research. So whether that be writing an article or doing a poster or working on a book chapter, those were things that we saw more often presented to us. And so I jumped on one of those because I thought that it would be interesting, but also fulfill the requirement, and also was presented in the time frame when I was looking to get involved in that. I do think probably having more options for research would be helpful because it would be really daunting. I think it would be daunting without having a lot of research background to try to come up with a research project and steps through the project on my own.
All right, Dr. Vargas, did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so as was discussed earlier, a lot of times residents don't realize what their passion is, or they don't come up with an idea for a project until it's well into their second year, maybe sometimes beginning of their third year. So trying to go through the IRB process at that time for something similar to an RCT would be very daunting. So another route, especially in the medical education world, is just introducing them to types of research that is not the regular RCT that they're used to reading about in Journal Club, letting them know that there are other, IRB exempt studies that they could complete, get passed through IRB exemption pretty quickly, depending on the institution, and actually have something to publish, especially if it's something like a survey or a questionnaire, or just evaluating some portion of their current program, facility, patient care. That's something that's very easy, but doesn't fall into the category of just writing up a chapter or doing a QI project, that kind of thing. Dr. Messman?
And I think we also, as I spoke to before, making sure we're approaching them at a time that's kind of convenient for them in their education, but also teaching them time management strategies, explaining to them what exactly submitting to IRB entails, and that you do have to write up a lot of stuff, but that's going to help you later when you write your manuscript, and just help them understand how many hours they're going to need to use, and the time commitment, and giving them deadlines that are reasonable. I think helps them sort of demystify the whole aspect of doing a research project and make it not as daunting as it can seem. Okay, let me share my screen. I'll do our PGY3.
A couple of the biggest barriers I've had is I haven't had super passionate faculty that I've had as mentors. So like when someone's first on and show something just they are, it's something that's first you want to be more motivated.
All right. So that is Darren Moore. He's one of the PGY3s at Detroit Receiving. I don't know what he's talking about. All of the faculty at Detroit Receiving and Sinai Grace are very passionate, very involved. But his point being that if the faculty member isn't passionate, then how can we possibly expect the resident to be excited about a project that we're not excited about? So I think it's really important as a faculty member to inspire the resident to do something that's interesting to you, that's also interesting to them, and to motivate them to want to do the project. And to obviously make sure that you choose something that you're both interested in, and not try to force a resident to be involved in something that they don't really care about.
That's a very good point. Well, I think we have, and Dr. Messman, I think you finished your 3 vignettes. So congratulations, Dr. Vargas, Dr. Messman. We have 4 minutes left for discussion, and let's have some discussion. So any comments from the Peanut Gallery or from anyone who wants to talk about resident research and how to get it better?
Hi, I had a question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. So we're on our way to Little League practice while I'm also listening, because we're having an issue with kind of a drop off of interest in research as residents progress through the program. And we've traditionally my program really encouraged interns to practice. That's we're going to baseball. Sorry, everyone. We've encouraged them to kind of like think about research as interns, but not really start a project until their second year. And we're a 4-year program. But frankly, like they're just losing interest. And I'm wondering what other people's experiences are with that in terms of when you engage your residents.
I can jump in. So just kind of going through a lot of what, has been published from other programs when they attempted to institute. I think that one, getting the interns involved early by showing in intern July orientation, have kind of just a quick round where the second and third years present what they've been working on, can one, pull interns onto a second and third year project. Two, will let the interns understand and realize that you are putting stock into resident research because you're highlighting them. You're taking an hour or two at resident conference to highlight their efforts so far. And along that same line, it benefits the second and third years because you can have faculty there that can chime in and give some input. They can give advice as to what are the best next steps. So I think just integrating at least something every year will keep that interest going and drive it, and have it be expressed that it is important, because nobody wants to do all of this work on a job that they don't get credit for, doesn't get seen. It's just not as satisfying.
To kind of build on what Kelsey was saying, at our institution, we have a research day every year where we present kind of research from residents, from faculty and other staff within our department, and we award an award for the best resident researcher. And I think that's helpful to let the residents know that their work is being seen and it's being appreciated, even if it's not necessarily at a national forum.
Some residency programs have a scholarly track system that they have for the interns with a round robin type of approach, and then they sort of commit to their scholarly track as the PGY 2-year approaches. So some of those typical tracks might be resident research, others might involve administrative things, quality improvement, teaching, and just different maybe community medicine, different tracks that fit with a particular program. So if you get all of the interns at least up to speed and have a chance to just dabble a little bit as observers in the beginning, then they can make a better choice. And then you'll end up with the residents who truly want to be doing actual research, which is a lot more rewarding for the faculty as they go through. And then you have a built-in structure with your scholarly track that these people are like a smaller element of your residency family.
Great point. Any other questions? They're going to cut us off eventually, but let's run it into the ground.
I'm Trisha Smith from Emory. I just have thanks for this talk. I've been like jotting down points. I wanted to just bring up the perspective about how COVID has changed a number of industries in terms of what people are willing to do in their commitment to work in general. And so while people are thinking about how satisfied they are with what benefits they get out of how much they put into work, I was wondering if anybody could talk a little bit more about how we can incentivize residents while we compete with the fact that, you could spend 8 hours working on a manuscript or punching data, or you could earn 8 hours worth of money doing a clinical shift, or for residents who are trading time, investing in research where they could be doing other things like preparing for the community jobs that are appealing to them more and more.
I can take this one. Hi, Trisha. This is Nidhi. So I feel like the residents want to feel rewarded, and they'll definitely want to have something to be written on their CV by the time if they do something, like the scholarly activity when they graduate, they want to have that. But what they don't want to do is they don't want to be seen as doing the scut work for the researchers. So I think it is very important to provide them with some sort of support, and the support will need some money most of the times. But there are other ways, like there are the volunteer research associate programs, and if you can train some of the research associates to do that data, or like what we do at our health system now, we have data analyst. If a resident chooses to do like a QI project or a retrospective analysis, we can abstract a lot of data, a lot of data electronically. We literally need one or two variables for chart abstraction, which they would really appreciate, because doing doing this cut work is the last thing they want to do, and that's where a lot of the interest like logarithmically goes down for doing it.
I would say add to that, sort of in line with what some others have said, it would be like highlighting the successes of previous residents. And it really helps when people that are coming in see like, that someone's had an abstract or has gotten to present at a national meeting, or even like a, like a local or regional meeting. But another thing to consider too would be like who your target resident is, and I guess what I mean by that is sort of what kind of career trajectory they think they want to have. And so it's nice to we'd all like more residents do more research and find it rewarding, but I think for the most part that's not true. And so something that I have found, at least personally rewarding, and which helps the residents get something out of it too, is sort of is being selective about the people that I'm trying to mentor and get to work with. So it's like we're not going to be able to reach everybody and have them do everything, but trying to take an interest in people. If medical education is your field of expertise, finding the residents that seem like they're kind of interested in that, or they're asking questions on shift. Like, I'm not a med ed researcher, but I know Dr. Messman is, so people ask me questions. That's a great question. I'm not really sure what the answer is. You should go talk to Anne. Whereas I do, some clinical research stuff. So again, I try to point people, bring people in to work with me, or, point them in if someone wants to do, heart failure, point them in kind of that direction, but try to be selective in terms of, who you're trying to reach.
So two things I take from that. One is know who you work with, know what their skills are, and know when you should kick them over to that other person because they know more than you. And then the second thing is, don't just give your resources indiscriminately, but look for the people that are going to appreciate them the most, and perhaps focus more on people that seem more interested or more motivated to do research. That seems like a take home for me. Other comments before they pull the plug?
All right, just one last one before everybody disappears. I agree with those. I just think that we're about to hit a part of the cliff where we lose the overall number of residents that are interested in research in general. And so in the same way that money motivates faculty to do a number of things, it takes a very small amount of money to motivate a resident just because they don't earn a lot. And I ended up as a resident going to every ACEP meeting and every SAEM meeting for free, because if you had something to present, my residency would actually fund it. So I stayed in a nice hotel and ended up, taking 5 days off to go to a fun conference and meet a lot of interesting people just by, finding a tiny little abstract or a poster, or, giving some kind of 5-minute Ignite talk or something at one of these sessions. So I think that might be helpful to throw out as well.
It's really good. Little things make a big difference sometimes, especially with residents or students.
Yeah, I try to motivate people with food. If I have residents do chart review, I say I'll take you out to dinner, or when we did things like that, or at me, when the whole class comes to like a meeting, I take a couple people out to dinner, like buy them pizza or that kind of stuff, because that stuff is definitely
Okay, well, it looks like people are jumping off, so perhaps it's time to sign off unless anybody has any last minute comments. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your week.